Okay, up next we have our native fish panel, and I'd like to introduce Liz Perkin with the Native Fish Society, and she can tell you the name of her presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I feel like the standard has been really high with the talks. Really great presentations that we've seen already, so hopefully I can continue that. I'm going to be talking about the 3 R's, restoration, reintroduction, and REDS in the Molalla River. I'm lucky enough that I grew up in the Molalla River watershed. This is my home waters that I'm going to be talking about. I grew up on a small cattle farm outside of Canby. What's really unique and special about the Molalla River in particular is that if you're not familiar with it, it is a free-flowing tributary of the Willamette. It's the only major east side tributary of the Willamette that's free-flowing, so it doesn't have any dams. And so this makes it a really promising river for a wild fish river. Now, actually, I want to take us back to September of 2020. And during this time period, I actually wasn't in the Molalla River watershed. At the time, I was working as a fish biologist doing habitat restoration in Alberta, Canada. And the morning of September 9th, 2020, I was about to go out on a 12-hour field day without any internet connection, any Wi-Fi. And just before I left, my mom sent me this text, this photo and text from the house I grew up in, the house that she still lives in, and said, "I'm all ready to go. We're on an orange alert, but I can't leave yet because the road that we live on is a major thoroughfare for the people who are on red alert and have to leave." And so I spent the entire 12 hours anxious and afraid, wondering if my mom was going to be okay, if the house I grew up in was going to burn down, and knowing that many of the landscapes that I loved were burning for sure, and wondering what that meant in the future. And I bring this up to start with because I think that many people in the audience probably experienced some trauma around those Labor Day fires in 2020. Fires obviously really destructive and scary. So I want to acknowledge that, but I also then want to talk about how fire can be really regenerative and positive as well. And so I want to start by actually reconnecting to the past. So the Molalla River is named after the people who lived there first. The Molalla people were active caretakers. They were actively managing that landscape. And they used fire, actually, to help maintain and manage those lands. So they were using fire to maintain oak woodlands. They were using that to maintain camas meadows. It was often the women who decided where to set those fires, using years and generations of knowledge. Unfortunately, the Molalla people were forcefully removed from their lands onto a very small reservation on the east slope of the Coast Range. The Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronce, the Molalla, are now a part of that Confederated Tribes. Those Confederated Tribes are actually made up of many tribes from across Western Oregon. It covers a vast area. And so the Molalla, they're still active. We're working with the Confederate Tribes of Grand Ronce on this project that I'm going to tell you about. They're still very involved. And I want us to kind of be grounded in that past to recognize that humans are not separate from nature, right? And I think one of the most important things to learn from that indigenous knowledge is that we're caretakers of the land, and we have a responsibility to it. So to really understand where we stand with the Molalla currently, we have to go after the Molallas were forcefully removed from their lands. We started an extraction-based viewpoint of the watershed. So there was massive logging that happened. Many of these log drives happened, so they used the rivers to transport the logs. And so then basically it removed all of the naturally occurring wood in rivers, the wood that gives shape and diversity to river ecosystems. And so this removed the wood. It also forced the river into a more of a single thread channel and really simplified the ecosystem. And this history of logging extends today. So this is a photo that was taken, I think, in 2015. kind of showing this patchwork of large-scale clear cutting throughout that you see throughout the watershed. This is taken before the fires. Oops, sorry. And so this is a photo of the Molalla today. It looks really beautiful, right? You look at it, it's clear, good water quality. There's a lot of trout in this river, so we think this is a really positive place. But at the same time, in my background in river ecology, I look at this and I'm like, wow, that's a really simple channel with not great fish habitat, actually. So there's not a lot of kind of holding pools. There's not side channels for juvenile fish to go in. There's a lack of places for adult fish to spawn. And all of that is a result of that past land use history. And as a result of this land use history, too, we've seen huge declines, unfortunately, in the native anadromous fish in particular. So that is really wild winter steelhead and spring chinook. And as a result of this decrease, then, I'm going to shift to talk about the reintroduction effort and red counts. So for those of you who aren't familiar, reds are what we call basically the salmon nests. So the female salmon or steelhead will come back from the ocean. They'll use their tails to dig into the substrate of the river bottom and create these areas where then they lay their eggs. The males will fertilize those eggs, and then they'll move a little further forward and cover them, do the same thing and cover them up. And that results in reds. And so this is going to be a real dynamic presentation. I'm going to jump down. Hopefully you can still see me. I'm really short. And so this is actually, it's a steelhead red. Unfortunately, I don't have that many photos of spring chinook, but you can see there's actually a pair of steelhead spawning here, and this where this gravel is clean is that red. So ODFW has been monitoring the situation. Native Fish Society has actually worked with ODFW to monitor spring chinook, is the real big concern in the basin. And we've seen big declines of spring chinook in the basin. And so as a result of that, just recently, starting in 2020, ODFW decided to try to boost the populations by reintroducing some fry. Now, a typical hatchery fish is not great to reintroduce into the wild. Very quickly, hatchery fish will adapt to that hatchery environment. They domesticate within one generation. And those are actually genetic changes. And so what's unfortunate about that is, so they get really well adapted to that hatchery environment, to overcrowding, things like that. And so then when they spawn with wild fish, they actually decrease the survival of those wild fish they spawn with. So these fish that they were using for the reintroduction, these fry, were actually spawned in a research hatchery where they're trying some very different methods to try to create fish that are more like wild fish. And so some of the things that they're doing is they're actually rearing the eggs in gravels like they would be reared in the wild. They have more complex habitats, and they're rearing at very low densities. And so it's not perfect, but we are finding that those fish behave much more like wild fish. So they've been reintroducing these fry, and they're reintroducing them as fry, not as smolts, to try to really get them acclimated and cued in on that Molalla River water. So when they come back from the ocean, they're really smelling out the Molalla specifically and returning to the Molalla River. And so here's a bucket of ODFW crew members putting the fry in the stream. And so these are the numbers of the released fry. So in 2020 was the first year. We've had about 20,000 released each year. And I've got the blue bar represents the tagged fry. So that's a subset. And so we've pit tagged those fry. If you have a pet that has a tag in them for ID, it's the same sort of tag that we can put in fish. And then we have these detection arrays throughout river systems, so we can actually track them as they move up and downstream, so we can kind of see how well they're surviving. So we have some of those surviving. Because these were released in 2020, we did see the first then batch just started returning last year, but we really expect the big pulse from these fry to start returning this this year. They're actually returning now as we speak. So they return now and they'll spawn in the fall. And then in addition to those fry, we've also have released some adult hatchery broodstock from the Santiam. So these are excess hatchery broodstock that aren't needed for that program. I'm not, if I'm honest, entirely crazy about releasing adult hatchery fish into the system. But we do have, sorry. I keep trying to push the laser pointer, and the reason I'm down here is to show you things. So we have females in red and males in blue. It's not a terribly high number of fish in there, but we're just trying to boost those numbers a little bit to get some more fish showing up. And so this is a spring Chinook red then that gets monitored. You can see the sort of substrate that they like to use for their reds is kind of this gravel material. The rocks can't be too big. Chinook can move fairly large substrate, but if it's too big, they can't move it to create a good red. And so as I mentioned, so Native Fish Society members, volunteers have helped actually with these red counts in the Molalla. So it basically consists of walking along the stream and looking for those clean areas of gravel where the fish have spawned and just counting how many reds are there and how many live fish are there. And you can see that, there's been ups and downs, but it's been generally just not great in recent years. And especially so 2018 was particularly low, and that's where we found, that's kind of when this idea of reintroduction started to happen. You can see there was no red surveys for a number of years as well. So I actually helped out with a spawning survey last fall, and in the roughly 1 mile reach that I surveyed, I saw this one red, and that was it. And part of it was because I could walk really, really fast, because actually most of the areas were these really large cobbles where they couldn't possibly have a red. There just isn't the material there for these fish to build their reds. And so what we found is it's not enough to rewild by reintroducing the fish. We also need to restore the ecosystem too, right? So we need to rewild the ecosystem. And so that's really what we're working on now. And this is actually a photo from the Sandy River Basin, the Zigzag River, where there's already been some restoration. So we're just getting started. But remember, so I talked about using the fires as a catalyst for good. And really, the funding for this restoration has come from the fires, as a result of the fires. So this is a burn severity map. And you can see some of the highest burn severity is in this area, this rough area where we're going to be doing a lot of our projects. The Molalla is where this is the Riverside fire actually that affected the North Fork of the Molalla, and then the Beachy Creek fire came up and affected most of the main stem Molalla. And so these are some specific restoration locations. We've got both private and federal lands that we're working on. And to give you a sense of what this looks like, this is what I'm talking about, where it's just this really large cobble and very simple habitats. And kind of here's what that looks like in an overview, kind of that same area in a Google map. And so we're going to restore this area. We're going to put a side channel in, as well as some large wood. So these are highly engineered wood structures that hydrological engineers have planned. So there's wood going to be put in different locations. There'll actually be this side channel constructed that will provide really nice rearing habitat for juveniles. So again, so we want to go from this really simple sort of structure to something that's more complex. So we've got, areas that are still quite fast moving, but then some slower areas. And what happens there is then those areas start to collect spawning gravels. So those create the places where the fish can actually spawn. And just to give you kind of a view of what we're aiming for, the ideal sort of situation. I worked on the Queets River up in Washington State on the Olympic Peninsula for my master's. And the Queets is a great river to look at for what a wild natural river looks like. So it's really active, and I marked these piles of large wood that are throughout the floodplain. And trust me, if you walk across this forest here, there's a lot more wood in there that has shaped the river and is actually, that river moves all the time. And so you have these really complex habitats. You have places that are slow moving, you have places that are fast moving. And so it's just a great place for fish to spawn, to survive as adults, and to rear as juveniles. But I also want to finish up by kind of circling back around to what I talked to about our responsibility to places that we're really part of nature. We can't see ourselves as separate from nature. So while we look maybe to the rivers like the Queets as an example of what we'd like to achieve, that shouldn't stop us from doing restoration places like Crystal Springs in Southeast Portland. Right? That's just as important. We have steelhead and coho coming back to the stream now that's in Portland. And when we start to accept our responsibility as caretakers, I think that's when we really actually start to see rewilding succeed. And so I know I'm kind of running over here, but I just want to acknowledge the many people. We've got state people from ODFW, we've got people from BLM, private contractors, and of course then there were some people who I couldn't find pictures of, so I wanted to include them, but lots and lots of people on a project that's large like this who have contributed. So thank you so much, and I'm gonna introduce